Uh, Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. Um, we are participating in a process that has been organized by CID, which works across Harvard University and a global network of researchers and scientists around the world to build, convene, and deploy talent to address the world's most pressing challenges. Uh, this is a very pressing challenge that we're talking about today, the devastating Turkey and Syria earthquakes. My name is Jennifer Lee. I'm a senior research fellow at the FXB Center for Health and Human Rights at Harvard University, and former director of the FXB Center, and retired professor of the practice of health and human rights at the Harvard Chan School of Public Health. Um, I'm a medical doctor and have worked in a number of settings hit by disasters and war, and am somewhat familiar with the region, having spent some time in Gaziantep, Turkey, in my role as co-chair of the Lancet Commission on Syria, and in Lebanon for quite a long time during that process. So um, it it is a real pleasure for me to be able to welcome um, these two very knowledgeable people who can talk to us from their different perspectives about the issues facing Turkey and Syria in the wake of these terrible earthquakes. Um, it just its background that this we're talking about the earthquakes that hit Syria and Turkey on February 6th this year, striking around 4 a.m. and estimated at a Richter scale of a 7.8 magnitude, which is a very strong earthquake. Uh, and the person who's going to talk with us uh, about the Turkey side of things is a senior policy researcher with Oxfam, Mia Tong. It's called Oxfam Kedif because it is a 30-year-old organization that is affiliated with Oxfam in Turkey. And so Mia will talk about the Turkey situation, and then Hazem Rahawi, who is a program manager at the American Relief Coalition for Syria, which includes a number of the major medical organizations that have been working locally and around the world, Syrian doctors primarily. And he will speak to us about the situation in Syria, northern Syria, from his perspective. I should say that this earthquake has several aspects that one must bear in mind when one evaluates earthquakes. And one of them is the time of day it occurred. 4 a.m., nobody is good at problem solving. This is February, it was very cold in both areas. And the construction of the cities in Turkey were not up to code, to put it mildly. So that was a major issue with the collapse and then the very high casualties that we found. The areas that were hit in Syria were often tents as well as buildings. And I know that Hassan will mention that. So from that perspective of what to think about this earthquake, a 7.8 magnitude earthquake is devastating as it strikes people in insecure settings and very early in the morning when they're dead asleep. So Mia, over to you. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, thank you very much for having me this evening or this afternoon, depending on where you are. My name is Mia Tong, and I'm a research and policy officer at Oxfam Kedif. And as Jennifer just mentioned, Oxfam Kedif is a women's foundation that was that is the Oxfam affiliate in Turkey. And it has been working for 30 years to support women's economic and social empowerment in Turkey. I wanted to share with you a little bit about some observations that we've had regarding the overall response to the earthquakes, as well as some of the implications that this has had for local and national civil society and the wider recovery and reconstruction process. And in the process of this, I'll also be sharing a little bit about what we as Oxfam Kiddiv have been doing to respond to the earthquakes. To start off with, I would like to really just underline again that the impacts of the earthquakes have been tremendous. And at the end of the day, that the biggest challenge has been overcoming the sheer scale of the impact of the earthquakes to be able to reach the needs of affected communities. I mean, we're talking about over 50,000 people have lost their lives in Turkey alone, and as well as over 107,000 injuries. And this, to put this into perspective, this means that most people in the country have lost someone that they love or know of someone that have lost their lives in the earthquake, and which has been creating a lot of trauma at the entire national level. In geographic terms as well, the size of the area that's affected is 3 times the size of Belgium. And to put that into perspective, that's about the size of the entirety of Michigan state. And this area hosted a population of about 15.2 million people, which included more than 1.7 million Syrian refugees that were already displaced from conflict and were living in a situation of protracted displacement and with social and economic precarity. One thing that I would like to share about the context before jumping into some observations about Turkey is that in Turkey, many people right now are living in formal government-supported tent cities, which generally have had better access to services and facilities. And these at the moment are currently gradually being converted into container cities over time as the earthquake response transitions from humanitarian response to recovery and reconstruction. But in addition to that, there's also an additional 1.6 million people living in informal settlements in tents that are generally positioned near damaged homes, where there's generally a lot more limited access to basic needs and services like water and toilets and showers. And there's a lot more risks of overcrowding and lack of lighting and basic safety issues, which are especially impacting women and children. In terms of the list of current and ongoing needs, the list is immense. I mean, but the most urgent that has been consistent from the day of the earthquakes to this date has been the continued need for shelter, water, food, showers and toilets, and psychosocial support, to name a few. At the same time, there's also a really urgent need right now to kind of start providing more longer term forms of support that enable people to be able to rebuild their lives and their livelihoods, and to support the economic and social recovery of the affected areas. At the same time, one of the main points of current challenges that I would like to highlight today is with regards to the fact that and as is the case with any other emergency or disaster that we've worked through in the past, women are disproportionately impacted by the disasters. And this is not just with regards to the safety issues and the potential of violence being inflicted upon people who have been displaced as a result of the earthquakes. We're also talking about women who've been women are generally shouldering a lot of the care responsibilities for taking care of their families and their communities. And they've often been left in the position of being the primary caregivers for children, elderly and their families, and people with disabilities, in a setting where there's a basic lack of basic needs and services, and where there's issues in accessing water, basic infrastructure problems, and lack of shelter and problems with security. And at the same time, there's an implicit expectation on many women in these settings that they are responsible for the upkeep and the management and the cleaning of public spaces that are set up in the settlements, and with the expectation that they would be delivering this work unpaid. And so in addition to that, there's also one other issue that we've noticed, especially, is the lack of women accessible spaces. And this has also been creating challenges for the general recovery, which means that many women and girls are feeling a lot more isolated in an already traumatizing period, which is also hampering their ability to heal from the trauma. What are we doing as Oxfam in response to all of this is that we are scaling up currently a humanitarian response in 3 different provinces that have been very heavily impacted by the earthquakes. And these are Gaziantep, Kahramanmaraş, and Hatay. And our response has been centered around one, keeping people safe and protecting their rights through setting up information hubs, as well as setting up women and children's centers as safe spaces. Two, providing clean drinking water and repairing water infrastructure systems so that there's access to clean, safe drinking water. And three, we're also focused on getting food to people where they need it, as well as trying to secure and restore livelihoods. So at first, we were very much providing food through the support of women's cooperatives. But now that's transitioning to working with partners like women's cooperatives to kind of create income generating opportunities to help women to support themselves and their families. And to do all of this, we're very much drawing on our experiences of responding to the 1999 Marmara earthquakes, which was another very serious earthquake that took place in Turkey that claimed over 17,000 people's lives. In response to those earthquakes, one of our key approaches was to support women in the community and to be able to carry out needs assessments in their community so that they could assess what are the needs themselves and then to develop solutions to address those needs. And so to do this, in this response, we're setting up women and children's centers and tent and container settlements across each of these three provinces so that we can support women's organizing and to create spaces where they can scale up responses themselves as well. One other general observation that I would like to share about the earthquake response is about the scale up of local humanitarian actors and the general growth of local humanitarian leadership in the context of this earthquake response. Because what we observed in the first days and to this date is that in the immediate aftermath of the earthquakes, there was a huge range of local and national civil society actors that really quickly mobilized to provide life-saving support to survivors from the first day and to meet the humanitarian needs of people in the region. And this included not just local and national civil society organizations positioned all across Turkey, but also refugee-led organizations and initiatives, women's organizations and other rights-based organizations, private sector actors, chambers of commerce and volunteer networks, informal networks, local municipalities from across Turkey and hometown associations, student associations, alumni associations. I mean, you name it, really. I mean, everyone was there trying to provide some source of support. And these organizations and actors were very much quicker than, say, other classic and more formal humanitarian responders in the wake of a disaster, such as UN agencies or international NGOs. But what we found in the most recent in the following weeks was that this story about the scale up of local humanitarian actors has kind of been lost with the arrival of more formal international humanitarian coordination structures and mechanisms for the earthquake response. And this with the underlying assumption that they're not necessarily the real responders. And so as a result, what we found is that many local and national civil society organizations and their networks are continuing to go unrecognized. They're continuing to not be communicated with in the earthquake response, as well as there continues to be a lack of investment in ensuring the sustainability of these organizations. And I know that Jennifer is trying to stop me now, so perhaps maybe I can continue more about this in the Q&A.
Perfect. That's just what I was thinking. I'm sure there are going to be a lot of questions. It's impossible to cover this earthquake, Turkey or Syria, in the time allotted. So I respect your discipline on this. So Hazem Rahawi, please tell us about how Syria is faring. And doing that, you may have to tell us in what difficult shape that northern Syria area was, and a bit about the problem with the border. Okay, I'm sure you're going to mention that, the closed border, though. Okay.
Yeah, definitely. Hello, everyone. My name is Hazem Rahawi, and I'm the Senior Programs Manager at the American Relief Coalition for Syria. I hope everybody is seeing my presentation. The American Relief Coalition, just a very quick introduction for us. We represent 11 Syrian American organizations based in Washington, D.C., with a mission to talk about Syria and empowering local humanitarian organizations. We do a lot of advocacy. Our main focus is being humanitarian access in Syria, humanitarian early recovery in Syria, and localization agenda, which we will come and you will see them implemented as we talk about this. So just to talk about Syria, and this is where you can see the difference between us and Turkey. So Syria now is in its 11th years, and it is an 11th year of an unabated humanitarian crisis. This situation, as you all know, we have what started as a revolution or as a movement of change turned into a massive humanitarian crisis. For us, we have been responding to this crisis, and for us, this crisis, as Jennifer knows, as many of you probably know, is one of the most complex and politicized humanitarian crises around the world. So every 6 months, we have a showdown at the UN Security Council where we try to convince members to authorize and continue authorizing UN agencies to conduct humanitarian cross-border aid from Turkey into northwest Syria. This is despite the overwhelming evidence of the effectiveness and trustworthiness of these operations in saving civilian lives and the unanimous demand from the humanitarian community to allow them to continue unfettered. So before February 6th, we were showing, the Syria crisis was showing all the hallmarks of unresolved, protracted man-made crisis. We had an ongoing conflict, economic collapse, donors' fatigue, rapid deterioration of humanitarian conditions, and the shrinkage of the humanitarian space responding to the increase in humanitarian needs. So on the backdrop of this, as Jennifer said, on February 6th, a massive earthquake hit Turkey and Syria, and followed up by another massive earthquake at 1:24 p.m. on the same day. That was huge and impactful. The impact of the crisis in itself was unfathomable. The numbers that we are talking about, sorry. This is, for example, showing the impact of that crisis. 8.8 million people were impacted by this earthquake. More than 4,500 lives were lost, and more than 10,400 were injured in northwest of Syria. 10,600 buildings were partially or completely destroyed. And as of April 11th, 103,000 cubic meters of debris have been removed by the humanitarian community, and 650,000 cubic meters are still waiting to be and needs to be removed. And finally, the World Bank estimated a total loss of more than $3.7 billion in damages. The intense of this crisis, on top of a protracted crisis, was huge, and it was crazy to be responding, even for us that we have been doing this in the past years, responding to the Syria crisis. So what we tried to do during all of that crisis was to find, in the first days, we were, as diaspora and as humanitarian operations, we tried to mobilize as quickly as possible. On the field, the diaspora mobilized very, very quickly, because what hit us mostly was that the location of the earthquake impacted the backbone of the response. So our colleagues on the field were impacted as long as their beneficiaries. This is a very unusual thing. And for us, we had to mobilize very, very quickly. Diaspora leadership was on the ground. For us, we were trying to support our colleagues off the field. And we reached out to the UN agencies, to member states, for the need to send aid inside Syria. The problem, of course, is that it all failed because of the politicization of the aid, and everybody was looking at each other in terms of countries and UN agencies, looking to how to will be able to send into northwest of Syria, where it is outside of the government-controlled area. For 3 days, Syrians were digging in the rubble, looking for saved lives with nobody else. I mean, it was only Syrian response, which made us really frustrated. And we tried to put the pressure on the UN, and we called out the UN and the international community for failing for the response. Things are getting up a little bit better. We try to, and as many of you know, the response in itself, we had a fully functional humanitarian response, which we utilized, but it continues to be very, I mean, now the flash appeal is at 97% of funding, but it's still to be very, very, the HRP in itself, which is the humanitarian response funding, it is the funding that goes for the entire humanitarian response, is still at 4%. It's at its lowest at this time of the year, and we are still in need of aid coming into northwest of Syria. And finally, while we have been doing emergency response in the past 11 years, we Syrians have pushed hard on the need to have early recovery activities and redevelopment to move ahead. While we know that we are still a humanitarian crisis, we definitely wanted the systems to be prepared, and we definitely want us to look into more resiliency and preparedness for future shocks. Unfortunately, this system is still not in there because of the ongoing conflict and the lack of any resolve of the political question. The thinking, even after the earthquake, we tried to push a lot on pressure on the donors. I think now donors are listening to us more, and we see a better alignment in all of this. On top of that, we were asking for localization, which means that direct funding going into local organization and Syrian diaspora organizations. The White Defense received that. The US pioneered this and started doing direct funding for the White Helmet, but it's still a very long shot to happen for other Syrian organizations. So we are trying to put as much alignment into going into all of this. Unfortunately, it's still we returned back after 2 months into the normal protracted crisis that we know about, but and donors are telling us that we should anticipate more cuts, but we're still hopeful that hopefully we can align with the entire response. That's all from my side. Thank you all.
Thank you, Hassan, for that brisk and detailed summary, but high-level summary. There's some interesting things to explore here. So we will talk maybe 5 minutes max back and forth, the three of us, and then I will open it up for questions. Is that okay? So if you could keep your responses fairly short, that would be helpful. So Hassan, to you, while it's fresh in people's minds, perhaps I can say it more bluntly than you, given your situation, but let's just be clear that this border between northern Syria and Turkey is a fluid border because people have learned how to cross, and the people on the Turkish side have been more or less welcoming, but it is not an authorized transit place. And the border between Turkey and Syria initially has been closed through the war by the government of Syria for a number of reasons. And now, in the last several years, as the war has waned down, it's become a humanitarian crisis, the government of Syria is still not recognizing the settlement of all the people in the north. But after the earthquake, they were interested, the government of Syria, in having that border opened so that aid could flow in. But then the international community was concerned that there would be the government of Syria control over that aid, augmenting the bottom line budget of Syria, which is in difficult straits, and not the aid flowing to the affected population in the northwest of Syria, which is in fact still enemy territory as far as the government of Syria is concerned. And I would say probably reciprocally, the government of Syria is enemy territory for those trapped in the northwest. So that's the very strange political dynamic. And the UN is pivotal to opening that border and also ensuring that much of the aid, if not all of it, goes and stays in northwest Syria. So it's complicated. The role of an outside agency in trying to raise money and awareness is a really hard one, Hassan. And I know that you have many connections on the ground. And could you just say something about the medical care? Because that's something I'm familiar with and also interested in terms of Syria, in northwest Syria. It's isolated. You have a fair number of wonderful doctors organizations up there. The problem in terms of medical care is that buildings, when they fall, they crush people. Mm. And you have significant blood loss. And then in the longer term, you can have problems of kidney failure as the limbs are relieved and they're broken and swollen. And all of the dead tissue goes into the bloodstream and strikes the heart and the kidneys. So how are those issues being handled? Now we're months out, but what was the issue in terms of rescue, emergency relief, medical relief, and then a problem of dialysis? And I might come back to you, Mia, to talk about that also as a very big problem in the Turkey side.
Yeah, thank you, Jennifer. I mean, for us, I mean, just to explain also here that the crossing borders between Turkey and Syria is not controlled by the government of Syria, but it's rather it's the UN interpreting that sovereignty remains with the government of Syria. So that was some discussion about it, and we're trying to discuss and more. The UN interprets this that you need a Security Council to do its activities inside. We have, at least in our organization, we've submitted a report that counter-argues this and says that actually in international law, the UN does not require, in this specific situation in northwest of Syria, it doesn't require an authorization either from the government of Syria or the UN Security Council. So we're trying to find ways to do that, but it's still a legal debate and a politics debate, which makes us very, at least in our lookout, is that a humanitarian access should be open, regardless of all of this, which makes us also angrier when that a huge crisis like the Syria earthquake did not mobilize the international system in the way that we wanted. So this is something that we need to put in our mind, because we anticipated a huge mobilization and breaking lines and breaking barriers to save lives. This did not happen at all, which made us question the entire system of the humanitarian response around the world, because for us, saving lives is a tenet and we should be putting all of this. Regarding your question on the medical part of it, as you know, Jennifer, we've been doing response for the past 10 years. Doctors have been adapted now to war surgeries, to all of that, because we were a community of responses to attacks and medical attacks on healthcare. So the system was a little bit better in adapting to receiving such crises. The problem that we are facing, first of all, is that because of the attacks, we don't have established buildings, established hospitals. All our operations have been dependent on field hospitals, on smaller healthcare that we are trying to do to close the gaps. We don't have advanced healthcare because we are stuck to the humanitarian response. Secondly, the lack of manpower, because through the years we lost so many colleagues, and there is no formal education system in northwest of Syria. The situation in Syria has been now for 12 years. So there is a degradation in the numbers, and that will also be very problematic for us. We're lacking the power, the doctors, the nurses, the system to allow all of this. On top of that, dialysis is something there that you can consider as you have quite a huge number of injuries and impact in a very short time. That overwhelmed the entire system. Putting in mind also that many hospitals were evacuated, either collapsed or evacuated because of damages to the buildings. So that all in all was very problematic for us. And luckily, in a way, I mean, I can say we didn't have the same structure as in Turkey, where you have cities well established, there's no war. The damage in Turkey was way higher because of all of this. For us, it's the damage because we are already a very strained humanitarian response, which made everything very, very, like it accumulated on top of all of this. That's at least what I have. And I hope that answered your question.
That's very helpful. And there's not really a saving grace of any kind that you can think of. I mean, in other words, something to celebrate in this context for either country. But the fact that the buildings were not so complicated, it was not so built up in the area that you were in, does mean that the salvage of life came down to what doctors and nurses and pharmacists and everybody else who have any training, they could mobilize around, and they were used to doing that because it was similar to war combat. So Thank you for that. Now, Mia, let's talk about, I'm interested in what you said about the women, and I'm also interested in what you said about these spaces that the women are supposed to clean up and be responsible for. So, first of all, there's tremendous loss of life in these cities, isn't there? And this is where the pancake concrete that crumbled as it fell trapped many people. So I'm not going to ask you to go into the medical issues, but they're myriad there, and we know some of them. But I'm thinking about those first images we saw that came through, where you saw the men standing around because they didn't have the equipment, and the women already trying to find water and cook food and take care of the babies and et cetera, et cetera. What you are describing is that burden of care on the women has increased more and become more complex, and in some ways become ever more onerous as time has gone on. There are more and more issues to solve, and it seems as what you're saying is the women are being asked to solve them. So I have a sort of abrupt question. What are the men doing? Mia, you're muted. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, well, as Oxfam Kidder, we are not, we're working with all communities, and we're working with both women and with men in trying to reach out here. But I mean, in terms of when it comes to organizing, and in terms of supporting this recovery process, what we've been really trying to just emphasize more than anything is to just to focus in on ensuring that the process of responding to the immediate needs of communities does not contribute to reinforcing existing gender divisions of labor, for instance. And so one of the things that we found is that in the process, one of the key issues that's being raised by many responders is that, say, for instance, that like I mentioned previously, as well as you mentioned just now, that a lot of the unpaid care work of the tent settlements is going towards women, while at the same time, a lot of the paid work is going towards the men. And so there's this kind of dichotomy that's taking place where there's the expectation that women would be delivering on the unpaid care work because this is what's already been done and this is the status quo, whereas the paid work opportunities or the paid work that it is available would be going towards men. And so what we're trying to do as much as possible is to try and ensure that whatever responses that we do account for the fact that so that we're not expecting women to be carrying out care responsibilities for the entire public or for all of the communities around them. And so they're just responsible for, say, for instance, their families. And we implement water and sanitation and hygiene approaches that try to adopt that as much as possible. So say, for instance, in setting up toilets and setting up latrines, we're making sure that in setting those up, we're also looking at how to make sure that we're ensuring that the maintenance is equally divided and it's not being pushed onto one group over another.
That's excellent. I mean, it's very difficult to do because such a wide geographic area, so many people in trouble and in these unstable and temporary settings. The issues of taking care of people who need to be taken care of, always in disasters, fall on the shoulders of women, don't they? And this must be particularly troublesome because there is still so much heavy work to do in terms of clearing, settling, creating space for people to find shelter, that the men are probably, by reason of habit and experience, being asked to do. But I think it is extremely important for at Oxfam and other organizations, but Oxfam here, to settle on the fact that women are going to crumble under the burden of taking care of not just their immediate family, but all the lost people, all the kids that are sort of orphaned, all the injured elderly who belong to many families. But this is a crucible that these surviving women should not have to endure solely. on the basis of their gender. And that is, it's a really important point that you're making, and one that I think Oxfam is very well positioned to deliver. I mean, I think it's great. Now, there are a couple of questions in the chat, and which might spark longer conversations. So if it's okay with you, I'm going to look in the Q&A and start with the first one, who was asking, what can someone who is listening to this webinar do to continue to help the situation, which has unfortunately dropped out of mainstream media, which is very accurate. Much to do, and mainstream media has moved on since so many other things are happening. What can someone do? And the question's anonymous, but I assume it's from somebody in the West, or somebody in an uninfected and relatively well-off part of the world. So, Mia,
Yeah,
why don't you take
I
that
can
one?
I
Okay.
can take I can
Okay.
answer here.
I'll go
First
do
of
that,
all,
and then Mia, they'll give you a moment to think about it. Okay.
yeah. I can start here by definitely, for us, what we are needing right now is continue. First of all, is definitely to raise awareness within your own community and with the university and with whatever you can about, for us in Syria, about the situation in Syria. For us, the earthquake is just an additional crisis that has been on top of the international of the Syria crisis over the past 12 years. It is horrible, and we unfortunately anticipate more and more. It's not only this one. There are diseases. Cholera now is making an appearance. Other things that are raising up, and water is going down. All of these issues are definitely important, and definitely follow up and continue to understand the situation and learn about this. The second is definitely funding local organizations and funding the smaller organizations that definitely are doing the work on the ground. I mean, we definitely appreciate the role of the UN agencies and international NGOs, because they cover gaps that are important, that are big. But the local organizations are the boots on the ground, and they are doing everything they can. I mean, I can't stress enough, in the first days, it was only us that we were doing everything. I mean, we were left totally alone, and the only way that we were able to survive and help our friends, our families, is by our own actions. So definitely, these are the two recommendations. And for us, these are the two important things that I hope that can help us as we move on.
It's difficult to, perhaps you can type into the Q&A, if you look at it, you could type in the names of some of the local organizations, but
Definitely
them is difficult. So also funding your organization, I bet, is helpful. And then a few of the key international relief organizations. I mean, I know that the ICRC and MSF have been active, and so that also is probably, a good place to go. But can you type those in? Is that okay? Are you doing that? Perfect. Okay. And now
I wanted to also jump in perhaps as well, because I wanted to expand on what Hazem was saying here. I mean, we absolutely agree that, I mean, first and foremost, funding for local and national organizations needs to be sustainable for this to be, because we're in for the long haul at the end of the day. I mean, we're looking at a recovery this is going to define the next decades for Turkey. And when it comes to there's a couple of things I just want to quickly share when it comes to funding for local and national organizations, which is that the tendency is that typically local and national organizations would receive the funds from an international organization, and most funding that's accessible for local and national organizations is through an international intermediary. But one of the challenges that we've found in our work over the past 10 years through the Syrian refugee response is that a lot of the times with the funding that goes through an international intermediary, this does not necessarily always account for overhead funding that would ensure the sustainability of a local or national organization. And so a lot of the times this would mean that they're only secured funding to implement a program, but they're not secured funding to be able to cover their basic costs for ensuring that the organization remains sustainable. And right now, this is very much important because the sustainability of the organizations is really going to define the extent to which these organizations can continue to support the people that have been affected by the earthquakes moving forward, especially as the international humanitarian system expires in Turkey as well, because we are looking at transitioning the international humanitarian coordination structure into an early recovery stage. And in Turkey, it's already led by the government of Turkey. And so the international system is temporary. And so at the end of the day, these local and national organizations, as they're kind of more permanent, there's more support that's needed to ensure their long-term sustainability.
But again, there's this question of how to support them. Okay, so it may be that Mia, you have some ideas, but also the organization that you're working for, Oxfam, is going to be there for a while, right? You've been there for a long time. So that may be one place to go, but there might be some other ones if you could put in the chat. Would that be okay?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, good. So there's a comment on a good question, comment on the situation of women, but I want to thank the person who asked that opening question because that is a crucial one. How can we still help? Okay, so this good question is, Mia mentioned the disproportionate impact that earthquake has had on women, including with childcare, household maintenance, and unpaid work maintaining public spaces. What mechanisms are in place by the women most impacted to communicate to relief organizations so that their needs and concerns can best be addressed? So the question is, how can these women who are being objectively abused, which may be too strong a word, but they're being crushed by their responsibilities, how can they seek help from the relief organizations and make their voices heard? So that seems to be pretty much, Mia, a question for you.
I mean, absolutely. I mean, this at the end of the day is really the responsibility of many of the relief organizations to make sure that they are in a position to be able to equally receive responses and to be able to receive feedback from women, because I think that at its core, this is a responsibility of all of the actors that are working to respond. And there are a lot of different ways that you could try and improve this. One of the key recommendations here has been to ensure that there are a sufficient number of female humanitarian workers, which has been a challenge in many contexts as well, because there's a tendency for women to not raise the concerns or raise the specific issues that they have if the person that they're raising it to is a man. And so one of the most basic recommendations is to just ensure that there's enough women working to provide support as well, so that women are feeling comfortable to be able to reach out about their issues.
I have a follow-up question to that one for you, Mia. Are the women organizing themselves, or are they too overwhelmed to be doing that? The local women, I mean.
I think it's hard to make a generalization here. We're definitely seeing a lot of local women's organizing, but at the same time, there is a lot of trauma that's taking place. And so I think we're seeing a little bit of a mixture of both. So what we're trying to do is, I think the most important thing is to make sure that we're in constant communication with them to see what they are comfortable with doing and to scale up and to support them in scaling up where they want to and where they can and they want to. And so this is one of the things that we've been doing right now, is communicating with women's cooperatives in Turkey to see to what extent they're interested in working with us to scale up a response. And many of them have responded positively, not all. And so for this, the most important strategy that we've been observing is to be in constant communication with women's cooperatives. And we as Oxfam KEDEV, we support the secretariat of the Union of Women's Cooperatives. It's a network of women's cooperatives in Turkey. And so we're in communication with many of them through this union. And so this has been providing a tremendous source of support. And there are a number of women's cooperatives already in some of the affected areas, say, for instance, in Hatay, that are scaling up and immediately responding. And many of them have commented that this has been a way of healing for some of them as well. And so we're very hesitant to we're constantly trying to ensure that while recognizing the sensitivities of the timing and the trauma, trying to figure out ways where they can help as well, so that they can also collectively heal.
Yeah, that's an important nuance in your response. I mean, Turkey has a very vigorous set of women's organizations and women consciousness throughout the country. So tapping into them and their various modalities to help with southern Turkey is an obvious and important strategy. That's not so much available for northwest Syria, which is problematic. But one's a war zone, the other is a very distressed part of a major country. So the responses and the resources are different for sure. There are two questions now that are on the same topic, both kind of complicated and informed. So I'll read one that's short. With different organizations involved, can you speak more to how there has been coordination and communication among them to better help the people in Syria and Turkey? Is there coordination, or does everyone work on their own? So that's an overall question. And the answer is going to be yes and no. But okay, so hold your response. And then there's another question, which is thanking you both for your incredible organizations and work that you're doing. And then there's mentioning the development work. There's been a lot of talk and perhaps some progress in shifting responsibility and funding to more local organizations. And yet the observation that still most of the funding is going to the major NGOs and the UN organizations. So in addition, this is how the question ends. In addition to providing core operating funding for local organizations, what needs to happen differently for organizations like yours? And this is differently in the sense of expect disasters to hit, expect crises to hit. What needs to happen so that it's not so devastating and difficult to get funds and resources and help to the local situation? So that's these questions are very good and probably the right ones for us to consider ending on. So you have I'll interrupt if there's another question that comes up, okay? But so think very creatively, and which you are doing, but also as if you were in charge of your organizations, okay? Oxfam Kedev and Hazem, your American Syria organization. What do you need to plan for so that something devastating like this could be better responded to by the local survivors? Or you don't need another thing to happen, given what has happened now, this devastation of the earthquake on top of war for you, Hazem. What needs to be done? So which one of you wants to go first?
I'm
Hazem.
happy to jump. I'm
Okay.
happy to jump in, but
Yeah.
no, it doesn't matter. I mean, Hazem, did you want to go, or
Yeah,
it
okay,
doesn't?
fine. Okay, good.
Okay, sure. So, I mean, in terms of the two questions that were asked, when it comes to coordination and communication, absolutely, there's a lot of coordination, actually. So one of the things that there's a lot of there's obviously the classic kind of international humanitarian coordination structures that have come with the start of the flash appeal. But even prior to that, there's quite a number of local and national coordination structures amongst local and national civil society organizations here in Turkey. So we are a member to one of them, which is the National Disaster Response Platform. It's a network made up of 27 organizations that were formed in response to earthquakes that took place in 2020 in Turkey in two separate parts of the country. And we're working very closely with them to coordinate, to understand where are the gaps, where are the needs, and we've been constantly in communication with them to figure out where existing needs are and sharing information and referrals so that we can get aid to the right places. Especially in the early days, this was really important for getting aid in the more rural areas that were very much overlooked in the initial response due to the overwhelming nature of everything taking place in the urban areas itself. In addition to that, there's also some promising initiatives right now that are taking place where there's a newly formed platform called the Local Humanitarian Forum, which is made up of over 60 local and national civil society organizations that are working across the country to specifically for the purposes to ensure that local and national organizations are meaningfully included in the international humanitarian coordination structures. And this really kind of just ties into my response to Fatima as well, to the second question, which is what else can we be doing besides funding and core costs, which is that one of the challenges in a humanitarian, one of the challenges that takes place is just the visibility of local and national organizations is really eroded in this context of international humanitarian coordination structures. And so one way to really kind of support local and national organizations as well is to make sure that they're meaningfully included in the decision-making of these structures and to create mechanisms to ensure that they can be meaningfully included. Because a lot of the times, one of the challenges is that, I mean, in the core funding, in the issues of the funding itself, there's no funding to ensure that there's a advocacy person, say, for instance, within a local organization that could meaningfully, regularly participate and lead in the coordination, lead coordination structures as well as participate on its own. And so there are some promising trends in Turkey right now with regards to this, where we're trying to secure funding to ensure that local and national organizations are meaningfully included in these coordination structures, especially as we transition into the early recovery phase. One other thing that I just want to flag in terms of answering to the second question, I know I'm so sorry, but it's is that there's a tendency to kind of overlook the existing capacities of local and national actors, and there's a tendency to approach local and national organizations as needing capacity building. And I think once we start shifting away from that mentality and looking at acknowledging existing capacities and meeting kind of more in the middle, then we might be able to overcome some of these funding hurdles as well.
Very good point. Thank you for that abundantly rich answer, Mia. But it is also the case, as you both know, and as our audience knows, the evolution of civil society, governance, and capacities of Turkey versus Northwest Syria are incommensurate. I mean, you're dealing with a devastated area that is struggling for recognition, very, very difficult and torn up governance, and virtually destitute in terms of money and high-tech personnel and many other things. Low-tech personnel, they've got people who survived the war, who are still there. It's still a war zone. So there's problem solving baked into now the mentality of all those who've survived and are now working together. But the remoteness of Northwest Syria here, I think, needs to be factored into your response, Hazem, about how local capacity can be developed and can hook into a robust international community, because you don't have the same highly developed and highly arborized civil society that Turkey has.
Exactly. And for us, to answer the first question, we have a fully functional humanitarian response since 2014. So it's 9 years now operating. We coordinate, but unfortunately, the difference between us and Turkey is that we lack a governance structure. So it is the civil society that carries everything over, which means that coordination, there is a lot of load on the coordination itself. And that makes us that makes a lot of work on our shoulder that we need to coordinate and making sure, not always perfect, but we try our best to maintain all of this. And during the earthquake, actually, we were able to activate this very, very quickly, which I showed at least the strength of the civil society and the coalition, like the work that we were able to bring together, whether inside Syria or outside, inside Turkey, because remember, many of our colleagues were in Turkey. So we were able to bring that together in that short moment of time. So it is there, but it's not, doesn't always work perfect. And still, We struggle to push the INGOs and the UN to be able to respond to us in the way that we want them to operate. And that makes a lot of struggle, and it takes a lot of our work on this. Regarding the localization agenda, it's always, unfortunately, the difference I can add also is, for us, lack of resources is so much ingrained in our response that we can't shake it off. We will be able to operate more if we are able to do more. The problem is that as local organization stuck of that lack of resources, as you said, mostly is in the hands of international NGOs and UN agencies. This is unfortunately our main problem. This is our main Achilles heel. And with more resources, we will be able to do more and to activate and operate more. So that's why we maintain this. Localization agenda is still not implemented and it's not doing well. I think in the aftermath of the earthquake, donors are listening more, and we hope to see that implement, but it's very, very slow and it's not happening anytime soon.
Thank you for both of you for creating such vivid, detailed, and nuanced pictures of highly distressed situation with a long burden of care ahead of you and ahead of these societies. Earthquakes are extraordinarily devastating, and this earthquake or set of earthquakes is definitely the worst in this century, and may rival many that we have historically. So I think that having your voice with us today has been really wonderful. And we now have to close the session. And I'd like to thank the organizers at CID for hosting us and for organizing this conversation among the three of us and for attracting such a good audience. You've been a very good audience. Thank you. And so now we will sign off, but stay posted to CID postings, stay posted to their announcements of what they're going to be doing, because CID has its ear to the ground, as you can tell from finding these two wonderful people to talk to us today. So thank you very much to the audience, to Mia and Hazem for your contributions and wisdom, and to the organizers at CID. Goodbye.
Thank you for inviting us.
Thank you so much for inviting us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.